Richard can.
Yes.
Which I suspect means others can too. And can you see a bit of me and the slides, or just me? Oh, just the slides. Oh, look. It's not tried that one before. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad. I'll leave it like that. So I'm going to make myself a wee bit smaller because I've got a table coming up. Now, I gather there's some Slido polls for you. This talk is about elections, and yeah, my job is partly to study elections and voting and public opinion. I do lots of work on climate change attitudes at the moment, but I have mostly in my career been studying elections in Britain, and I do things like the exit poll on general election nights for the BBC Sky and ITN, and I work on election night for local elections and devolved elections and so on. But on this talk, I wanted, rather than get into the nitty gritty of any particular election, just take a big overview of all the elections over 100 years or so. And I've got some questions just to get us all thinking about what that means and what that means we're talking about. So my first question for you, if we can bring up the polls, can we? Are these questions in the polls, Richard?
Yes. Would you like me to switch screen, Steve? So I've got so we can also see what people are voting for as well when we do.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, great.
Let's do that, and then
I'll switch to me. Then I'll just get the right one. Here we are. Okay, I'll just get that off. And
so there's the first question. When was the first election at which Labour and the Conservatives were the top two parties? So if people can type in their answer, just calendar year, would be great. And see how long ago people think that was. So is that number that's coming up the average? Oh,
no, this is a word cloud, Steve. So it's individual guesses. So, but I can see also on the top of the screen, I can see there are a few people typing as we speak. Oh, here we go.
So we've got 1950, 1945, 1921, 1992, 1952. It's quite a range. 1962, 1980. Very good. Let's leave that there. And let me tell you, actually, the first election at which Labour and the Conservatives were the top two parties was 1922. So that was just over 100 years ago. And my next question for you then is, how many elections has the UK had in the last 100 years? First guess is 20. Yeah, general elections, as I see the question there. Just general elections. 30, 25, more than 20. 28. So these answers are getting close. 30, 32, another 20. I think if you average these answers, you might actually get The last couple coming in are a bit higher, but you might get close to the actual answer, which was 26. So one rough way of thinking about it is we're supposed to have elections at least every 5 years. And so if you took 100 years and divided it by 5, you would get 20. But as some of you probably know, we have elections more often than that because prime ministers can call them a bit earlier if they want to. And that's thought to be a huge advantage for prime ministers winning elections. So in fact, we've had 26 elections in the last 100 years, and that takes you back to the 1923 general election. But there's also that 1922 general election that I'm going to talk about in the talk. But just before we get to that, I want to ask you about what you think has been happening in terms of who wins and who loses general elections. So if we can turn to the next poll question, what percentage of elections in the last 100 years, so that's over the 26 that we just talked about, have been won by the sitting government? And in case there's questions of clarification, what I mean by won by the sitting government is won by the one in terms of they went on to form the next election. So we've got some high numbers here, and some low numbers. So quite a range. 80, 72, 27%, 12%, 18%, 50%. So it's a real mix of answers we've got. And some of you might have been swayed by the kind of clue that the title of the whole talk was that governments usually win. Actually, governments, whilst you might say they usually win, on average, they've won 54% of the time. And that is only just above 50% of the time. Now, some of you might know that conservative governments are sometimes thought to have won elections more often than Labour governments, or at least the Conservative Party has won more often than Labour. But what percentage of elections in the last 100 years have the Conservatives won? And again, when you're thinking about winning, we're talking about going on to form the next government, not necessarily winning in terms of share of the vote or winning a majority, but just going on to form the next government. Again, big range of numbers there. You can see 35, 45, 55, 60, 66, 70, all the way up to 80. And actually, the answer across the 26 elections since 1923 was 58%. So well done if you came close to that. Now, that means that the percentage of times the Conservatives have won is slightly larger than the percentage of times the government has won. And one of the things I'm going to be looking at and discussing towards the end of my talk is the extent to which we can reconcile those. Is this a story of Conservatives tend to form the government and Conservatives tend to win? Or is it a story of governments tending to win and some accidents that just mean that the Conservatives have ended up winning more often? So now I better go back to sharing my slides. And I will try a slightly different view in the hope that this will.
Steve, I'm loving the party political neutral background there with those three different colours. Just to
Yeah.
interrupt, just a warm invitation to all those who've just arrived that you can ask Steve questions. What I'll do is I'll chair them for him unless there are any questions of definition as we go along. Ask them on the Q&A tab, please, of the Slido, TBC4, and I'll see them coming up on my separate device here to put to Steve at an appropriate moment. Back to you, Steve.
Okay. So I'm going to start off by looking at this idea of the UK as a majoritarian system. So some of you might have heard of the idea of proportional representation systems for elections and majoritarian systems with so-called first past the post electoral systems. And the UK is the latter, which means that we tend to have politics dominated by two parties. And as you remember from the poll questions, we've had elections. The first election where the Conservatives and Labour were the top two parties was in 1922. And in fact, every single election, all 27 general elections since then, have had those two parties first or second in some order. So that is an extraordinarily stable two-party system. And that's been bolstered by the majoritarian institutions that have with the first past the post electoral system, and once you get into government, you have a lot of power to do what you like. For most of the last 100 years, you'd have said the UK is a unitary state. We now have a bit more of a complicated system, with the UK having devolved institutions in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland sometimes, and also local government. But power ultimately is centred in Westminster, and Westminster government is able sometimes to overrule those devolved institutions. And similarly, even when we were in the EU, which we were for several decades, most of the power was still in Westminster. So Westminster governments have been really quite able to do what they like. They often can also manage to whip their MPs to vote for whatever they want in Parliament, and get things through the House of Lords, especially since the House of Lords was weakened a lot in 1910. So we've got that system where governments get elected and then they can do what they like, and then they have to try and get re-elected. Now, given how much power they have, you kind of expect them to be able to look ahead, see what their voters want, and deliver for them. And they have enough power to be able to keep their voters happy and maybe even win some new voters. And so they go into the next election with a huge advantage over the opposition. So I've got two hypotheses there. And the first is that governments in the UK have enough powers to win elections. So they're fighting for re-election, and they just have to keep their current voters happy because they've already got a majority, or they enough to stay in power. Now, that doesn't always work. We know straight away, from our polling questions, they actually do lose quite a lot of the time. So why do they lose? And I'm going to posit that they lose when things go wrong. Sometimes they mess up, and sometimes things go wrong out of no particular fault of their own. You get international banking crises, cause huge recessions or economic crises of some other kind, and the government ends up being punished for things going wrong, whether or not it was their fault. And that is going to be the main alternative hypothesis, or at least not alternative, but complementary hypothesis. So we have governments winning, except when there's economic crisis, in which case they tend to lose. So I'm going to keep the story and the data and the talk very simple for today, but that's also deliberate, to try and get a clear picture of what's going on overall and see how much we can explain of are the big questions. I'm going to look at all the elections in the UK since 1922, all these elections since Labour and the Conservatives took first and second place. The other advantage of that date actually is it's the first election after the Republic of Ireland left the UK. So it covers the entire period where we've got the same borders and nearly all the electorates in place for all those elections, because you have female franchise, at least for the over 30s, and it's only the first 3 elections or so where it's women under 30 couldn't vote, and under 21s, male or female, couldn't vote. So you've got nearly all the electorate in place, and you've got the right borders all the way from 1922. So we're going to go do those elections. We're going to look, as I was mentioning in the polling questions, at whether the government won or lost. And by that, we mean whether or not the government actually carried on governing and formed the government after the election, or whether another party came into power. And it's actually always going to be Conservative or Labour governments. I'm going to code government wins and losses by the largest governing party. And there's always one largest governing party, and the Labour and Conservatives never go into coalition with each other. So if you're thinking about, say, the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition after 2010, actually that's just coded as a Conservative government. Now, the other thing is, how do we think about economic crises? Well, there's all sorts of ways you could try to measure economic crises. And I'm going to try and keep it simple. I'm looking at recessions and devaluations. Now, actually, these overlap a lot of the time. A lot of the devaluations occur at times when there's also a recession. But there are 2 key points where there are big currency devaluations that don't coincide with recessions. And one was the famous ERM crisis in 1992, September 1992, which was extremely costly for UK public finances. And it was damaging for the government's economic credibility at the time. And that's an example. The other is the devaluation in 1967 in Wilson's government. But other than that, all the other devaluations also coincide with recessions. Now, here's first key table. So this shows you whether governments won or whether they lost. Now, so I think I can't see the pointer. Can you see my pointer, Richard?
I can't see your pointer, no.
I'm going to have to maybe escape that view and reshare, but not do the fancy presentation. Can you see my pointer now?
I can. Can you just, move it around a bit?
Great. So you've got the government won or the government lost, whether there was an economic crisis since the last election or no economic crisis since the last election. So government won 15 out of the 27 elections there. So only just above half. And then there was an economic crisis in 14 of them, before 14 of them, and not before the other 13. Now, you might be thinking at this stage, hold on, how big a crisis is it if it's happening over half the time? You can the easiest way to think about it is crises don't happen over half the time, because it only takes a month for a crisis to happen, but you've got many months before an election. So actually these recessions or devaluations are typically happening, well, you can say there are 14 of them over 100 years, so 14% of the time. Now, what's going on in the body of the table? You can see that when there isn't an economic crisis, 10 of the elections were won by the government, and the other 3, the government lost. So governments really typically win elections when there isn't an economic crisis. But when there is an economic crisis, the balance is in the other direction. The government won 9 out of 14. And then there are 5 elections where the government managed to win despite there being an economic crisis. Now, this is not a perfect relationship, but it's quite a strong correlation, quite a strong pattern of association. But I think it actually is stronger than this table reveals because of what's going on with these 5. And I think we can explain these 3 as rather unusual. So the first thing to notice is these 3 are extraordinary elections because they all occurred within a year of the last one. So there was an election in 1922, and there was already another election in 23, and then in 24. And then in 1951 there was an election, even though there had already been an election in 1950 there. So these are all early elections, and what's more, they're basically elections that shouldn't have been called. Baldwin called this election by mistake, I would say, and lost. And then because it was a seriously hung parliament, the minority Labour government in 1924 couldn't stay for very long. And so this election only happened because this election happened and shouldn't have done. And then here in 1951, Clement Attlee called an election because the Labour government was very tired and infighting too much. Had he hung on till 1955, he would probably benefit from the economic boom and won, but he made a silly mistake and called the 1951 election, and that was the end of the Labour government. So I would say these are exceptional elections that don't fit the pattern because because they're elections that basically should not have happened.
Steve,
now, what about
sorry to interrupt for a moment. I mentioned that I'd generally save the questions for the end, but if any question emerged that was sort of pertinent to what you're talking about at precise time, we'll just have one through. It's a great question so far, but there's one through. If we're in economic crisis now, which seems fairly obvious, does the current government have much to fear from this relationship in the table?
Do you know what? I'm going to leave that to the end because
okay.
I will wrap up on what all this means for how to think about what's going on right now. So what about these 5? Well, I'm going to unpack that a bit to see what happens when you take into account leadership. Now, this is the same table again, but what I've done is I've split that bottom row between elections where there was a political change of prime minister after the economic crisis and those where there was no political change of prime minister after the crisis. And so you can see those 5 elections I pointed to have now been split between 2 cells, 3 here, 1922, 1959, and 1992. So this was Lloyd George being dropped in favour of Balfour in 1922, Anthony Eden after the Suez crisis being dropped in favour of Macmillan in 1959, and Margaret Thatcher being dropped after the early 90s recession in favour of John Major. And each of those cases, the government actually won by changing prime minister. So they saved the day. Notice that each of those 3 cases are cases of conservative governments changing prime minister. Now, Lloyd George was a Liberal, but he always depended in that 1918 to 1922 on a conservative majority in Parliament. His Liberal contingent was very small. Now, here in red are the other two, and they're the only two cases where a prime minister has won re-election after an economic crisis. 1950 was the re-election of Attlee after the 1945 landslide, and they fell an awful lot. They only just squeaked home, which is one of the reasons why they called the 1951 election carelessly. And then Margaret Thatcher might have been out, but she was rescued by the Falklands War, which boosted her popularity enormously. And she was also helped by a huge division in the opposition vote between the Alliance and the Labour Party, which helped her win a majority, even though her vote went down. So we've got two exceptional elections here, three exceptional elections here, but the other 22 elections fit a general theory that governments win elections unless there's an economic crisis, and unless they change prime minister to save themselves after an economic crisis. And this political bit also unravels the puzzle I raised earlier about why the Conservatives always winning. Also, not always winning. Why did the Conservatives win more than Labour? And actually, there's a little tendency for Conservatives just to win a little bit more often than Labour, regardless of the circumstances. But it's teeny tiny. But a really crucial understanding here is that the Conservatives have changed Prime Minister after crises for political reasons. Now, it's not the case that Labour never changed Prime Minister. They did in before the 2010 election in 2007, they switched from Blair to Brown. But the trouble was that was before the crisis, before the 2008 financial crisis. And so Brown suffered the consequences of that crisis. By contrast, what's gone on with the change in before 1979, well, 1979 is here. It's not coded as a political change of prime minister because Callaghan coming to power was as a result of Wilson giving up, not because of a crisis, but just because he'd had enough and he left at a time of his own choosing. And so, and yes, and again, you might say that the crisis was after Callaghan came to power, and particularly the winter of discontent was after Callaghan came to power. So just to summarize all that, we have governments tending to win elections, except after economic crisis, but changing a prime minister after a crisis can help. And that altogether explains 22 out of 27 election outcomes. So what does all of that mean for how we might think about the run up to the next election? So it's been an extraordinary time with the pandemic, leading to a recession because of lockdown, particularly. So the government deliberately shut down large parts of the economy in order to control the pandemic. And that's an unprecedented event. And it didn't lead to the government becoming hugely unpopular, or at least not straight away, not directly. The Conservative government carried on being pretty popular until Partygate and until the cost of living crisis started to kick in. And at that point, you get Boris Johnson being kicked out and replaced by Liz Truss, who made the economic circumstances even worse by trying to push for radical policies that the markets wouldn't bear. And since then, we've had Rishi Sunak, who's kind of rescued somewhat the Conservative poll situation, but still, just based on opinion polls, the Conservatives are well behind Labour and expecting to lose the next election, which is due by the very start of 2025 at the latest, and probably more likely towards the end of 2024, towards the end of next year. So technically, you could say, according to my measures, my crude measures, there has been a recession since the last election. There certainly has been an economic crisis by a broader context with fuel prices and the cost of living crisis and the strikes and all the other hardships that people are going through in Britain over the last year and even before within the pandemic. But you might also say that, well, technically, if Rishi Sunak doesn't see a recession under his watch, he might be an example of a prime minister that saves the day. And the latest figures show we haven't been in recession since Rishi Sunak came to power. And the figures are so borderline. And since GDP figures are subject to revision, it might turn out that we've been in recession after all. We just won't know until the statisticians really get the data to us. So I have to say that, even based on this kind of crude assumption of is it recession, is it not, you might say that it's ambiguous because the data are still a bit ambiguous. Let me stop there and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. Just leaving us hanging there, weren't you, with that conclusion? And then in the end, it was a hung conclusion on that one. Yeah, for that particular question relating to the economic crisis now and what the government has to fear or relish from that. Let's go back to another question which looked at the sort of politics and elements of what you were discussing. Why do governments tend not to go the whole distance of the full 5 years until calling an election? You mentioned before you think it could go on until 25, but they're likely to call an election earlier. I guess somebody's asked a question in response to that.
So the reasons governments call elections early vary. Sometimes they do it to try and give themselves an advantage. Other times they'd have to do it just because of some kind of crisis. So let's talk backwards. So there was an early election in 2019 because of the crisis in Parliament over delivering Brexit. Or you could say it was Boris Johnson wanting to take political advantage of the situation to try and get a majority when Theresa May had lost the majority in 2017. Theresa May had called an early election trying to get a political advantage, or so she argued, trying to win a bigger majority to deliver Brexit, and that went spectacularly wrong, even though she stayed in power, or at least in office. Power weakened considerably after losing the majority in 2017. So those are both examples where you might kind of quibble about whether it was necessary or whether there was just prime ministers taking advantage of a situation to try and get a better result. Going back to that early 1923 thing where I said it was a bit of a mistake, you could, being more charitable to Baldwin, say that he was very principled. He wanted to change the government's major policy on trade away from free trade towards protectionism, and said that because we didn't warn the public in 1922 about this, we should have a new election if we're going to change policy in this way. And then he suffered the consequences because it was not a popular move to change policy in that way. So there are all sorts of reasons. I won't, partly because there are other questions. Maybe I won't try and go through every election to explain every early election. But let me just mention one more. Crises. Perhaps the most famous crisis election was after Ted Heath in February 1974, where the economic situation was really dire with respect to union strikes and coal shortages from strikes from miners, that Britain had a 3-day working week, and power cuts, and Heath went to the country saying, "Who rules Britain? Do you want the unions to rule Britain, or do you want the government to rule Britain?" And maybe perhaps because he looked so weak, and unable to govern Britain, the government didn't, so the voters didn't return him to power, return him to office, and that's how we ended up with a transition from Conservative to Labour after an economic crisis in February 1974.
A nice one, just in relation to the ability to call elections. Do you think further reform of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is necessary? Should we allow governments to call snap elections whenever they wish?
I'd say that with most political scientists, it's actually unfair to have governments have the chance to call snap elections and get political advantage, even though this analysis shows that they can't always use that power to get advantage, and that more often than not, early elections are associated with losses rather than gains. The in principle, you shouldn't give one side an advantage over another, and so fixed term parliaments would be better. The trouble with the previous Fixed Term Parliament Act was it wasn't a properly fixed term system like they have in the United States. It was a system where the government could overrule or there was a mechanism for calling early elections within the Fixed Term Parliament Act. And indeed, there's always this thing with British politics and the Westminster system and the sovereignty of Parliament. It just takes an act of Parliament to get an early election. And so if there's a sufficient will, and the Lords are willing to play ball in the short term, you can get an early election, if you wanted to. And so, yeah, I think the simple answer is no, it's fairer to have fixed term parliaments.
Two questions which relate to a common thread that we have actually in these, which is asking about your sort of journey to where you are now, if that's okay,
Yeah,
Steve.
sure.
So firstly, what was your path to your current position in terms of the degree you did? When did you decide to go into university teaching and research?
So as a sort of A-level student, I was kind of a bit interested in politics, but I was more interested in maths at that stage. And I actually did double maths and physics A-levels, and came to Oxford as an undergraduate to do maths and philosophy. And it was only after the end of my first year that I kind of realized I was never going to be a research mathematician. I was getting a bit bored of learning proofs in mathematics. That the bits of maths I was still interested in was stats and logic, and I could do those in PPE, politics, philosophy, and economics. And what's more, I could do politics as well. So I did. I made a switch from maths and philosophy to PPE, and went straight into the second year and focused on politics and philosophy. And then towards the end, I realized I was really interested in voting behavior, and I wanted to do the statistical analysis of voting and public opinion. And to do that, I should really strengthen my skills in statistics. So I went to Southampton to do a master's in social statistics, and then came back to Oxford to do a doctorate in voting behaviour, particularly focusing on tactical voting. And then I followed a classic academic route of getting a postdoc position for two back-to-back for 3 years before getting my current job as a lecturer and tutor in politics here in Trinity. And actually, I've been here for 20 years now. I'm a bit of a long-term resident.
And you've also just answered a second question, which was basically when did he specifically get interested in elections? So to ask a question that a student asked physically in college today, a year 10 student, she was asking about sort of changing degrees. I guess your change of degree after a year, if anything, your maths and stats background, as clearly your further study showed, really helped your PPE studies, actually. Yeah. Whereas usually if they're taking people in a different direction, there might be sort of more of a question about making a switch or what would you here's a question related to sort of, I suppose, admissions and PPE. What would you advise for future PPE students at Oxford? So I'll get more specific with that question. Is there any particular sort of supercurricular area of study that there's some applicants find useful, for instance?
Yeah, I would first and foremost say work hard at your school subjects and get good A-level results and concentrate first and foremost on your main academic work. And then in terms of kind of stuff beyond that and applying for a particular subject, I mean, the first thing to notice is tutors want to see, and it's part of the selection criteria, that you've got to have some enthusiasm and interest in the subject you want to study. And people can show that in lots of different ways. With regard to politics, some people are really politically active in political parties, or they do debating societies or model United Nations, or some kind of political work. But a lot of people don't. A lot of people on their personal statements, they just write about having read certain books they're interested in politics, or reading certain news magazines. And whatever it is that you're interested to do with regard to politics, that's great. I would certainly recommend reading good books on politics, and there are various suggestions on the PPE website for the Oxford PPE website, targeted at people interested in coming to Oxford to study politics, economics and philosophy. And you can find other suggestions elsewhere.
Thank you. A very specific one on PPE. Do you think it would be a struggle to take PPE without doing A-level maths? And on a factual note, the university has maths down as a recommended rather than essential for PPE.
Yeah, that's right. It is recommended rather than essential. There are people who struggle, but that's not necessarily because they haven't done maths before. It's more about the individual and how comfortable they are with maths, and how much they like it, and how easy they find it. So typically, if you are not keen on maths, do have a think about economics and whether you'll enjoy it, because that's the main bit where the maths comes in. If you are really keen to do economics, don't be put off by the maths, but do realise that you will have to work on your maths, and you can do that before. But if you don't do it before coming to university, you'll need to knuckle down and improve your maths when you get to university. As with lots of subjects, having a good bit of maths is often very helpful.
I must say, Steve, on a personal note, as somebody who studied economics at the LSE in the days when economics wasn't essential to apply there, you know, I was fine with my maths, but I had to work on it, you know. But yeah, I did definitely have to work, even though it wasn't compulsory in those days, which is obviously decades ago. One last question on a degree note, and then more to the politics trends, and then we'll wrap up. Just very specifically, the question is, how different is a politics and international relations degree compared with politics alone? Well, at Oxford, we have politics combined with the philosophy and economics, as you've mentioned. I'll ask it another way. Do elements of international relations come into the study of politics at Oxford, for instance?
So yes, but before I get into that, let me just say something that I've neglected to point out before, is that even though I've talked about PPE, which is the biggest degree involving politics, there's also history and politics, which is very popular and very good. And maybe particularly if somebody's interested in international relations and politics, history and politics is very good because you can do certain international relationsy things in history. Now, international relations is part of the broader politics syllabus, which is extremely broad because it also includes things like sociology and demography. It includes political thought and comparative politics, and there's normally so much that people find it really kind of hard to choose amongst all the different things they're interested in. In terms of international relations, very specifically, there's a little bit in the first year politics course, particularly on whether democracies are less likely to go to war with each other. There's 5 core courses in the second year, of which you have to do 2 if you carry on with politics in your second year, and one of those 2 can be international relations. And then there's also more specialized subjects for the later part of the second year and the third year on international relations in the era of the 2 world wars, and Cold War international relations. And you can do a thesis on international relations. So roughly speaking, you could spend half of your final 2 years on international relations if that's what you're really interested in.
Thank you. And now we'll return just briefly, if we may, just to 3 questions to wrap up that are really on the sort of politics content to generalise. So firstly, how influential do you think opposition towards a particular member of government is in preventing a government from winning? For example, media scandals. I don't know whether this questioner has any particular individual in mind, but...
So can you repeat the question, because I didn't quite hear you?
How influential do you think opposition towards a particular member of government is in preventing a government from winning? For example, media scandals in brackets.
Okay, yeah. So actually, I'm going to go back to what I was saying and what's on this slide that you can see behind me. If you're looking across big time span of all the elections in the last 100 years, and you can explain those outcomes with respect to economic crises and then a few extra, 3 extra by noticing political changes of prime minister after crises, then if you can explain so much with just those factors, then that doesn't leave much room for explaining the rest with respect to the media. And it does feel a lot of the time as though the media is really important, and maybe things are changing, particularly with social media. But at the moment, I would say that big picture, actually, probably more fundamental factors are more important, much more important than the media.
And you've also just touched on it there in one of your examples. Do you think, penultimate question, do you think the trends of governments winning elections will change with the rise of social media?
All right. So I think they could do, but I would hesitate to predict a particular change. And I would default to say, maybe, but I don't particularly expect it.
Thank you. And then lastly, there's a nice flow of questions tonight. Does this pattern happen, meaning, I guess, the general direction of what you've been discussing, does this pattern happen only in the UK, or is this a worldwide scenario? For example, does this apply in democratic political models only? I guess by definition, it's democratic models only because non-democratic regimes don't have elections. But anyway, does this pattern happen only in the UK, or is this a worldwide scenario?
So going back to what I was saying at the beginning, this was a theory for majoritarian systems rather than proportional systems. And so if the theory is as general as I suggested, then it ought to apply to other countries with majoritarian election systems, like, for instance, the United States. And actually, the evidence in the US is that economic voting of the kind I've been talking about, but even more generally, just just how much the economy has gone up and down, is relatively strong. So if you look at the sort of macroeconomic forecasting models, political forecasting models based on macroeconomic variables, they have had a pretty good track record in the US and in quite detailed. This is and that is and it's actually stronger there, the kind of bread and butter economic voting, than it is in the UK. Japan, not exactly a majoritarian system, but interestingly has had a track record of governments winning unless there's an economic recession. But the thing is, they haven't had many economic recessions. So they had a few very early on post-war, and then they had a huge long period of no recessions and economic growth. And the Liberal Party just won repeatedly over that time period, and then only lost when there was economic difficulties in the 90s. And then they're back in power again. And even though economic things are not great in Japan in terms of slow growth, it's not exactly been recession. So it seems to work maybe in Japan and perhaps in some other countries like Barbados and other majoritarian countries. But in truth, this is a question I really hope to move on to try and explore in greater depth and look at this in a more comparative perspective in future, but I haven't done the work on that yet. But good question, thank you.
It's great. Some great questions tonight in terms of the content questions. I think they're absolutely brilliant. And I was emphasizing earlier, you know, the emphasis on sort of supercurricular activity as a learning journey. And what I think you've clearly done tonight is you've shown us a sort of staging post, and our attendees tonight can go away and have a look at different countries, for example, applying this model to them, and yeah, just starting the conversation rather than end it. Thank you so much, Steve, for your participation tonight and all these ideas you've put our way. Thank you to our audience for your great questions, and yeah, good luck with your onward learning journeys. Thanks very much, and goodbye from all of us at Trinity College. Cheerio.
Thank you very much, everyone. Cheers.